My name is Maya Vance. I am 31 years old. 3 weeks ago, my husband, Julian Sterling, struck me in front of 450 guests at our anniversary gala in Napa Valley. It wasn't a heavy blow, not the kind that knocks a woman to the floor, but it was precise. His wedding ring, a custom platinum band that cost more than my first 3 years of law school, split my lower lip against my teeth. And the most terrifying part? 450 people laughed. They didn't laugh because they were cruel, they laughed because Julian's father, the great Harris Sterling, had just finished a toast that turned my humiliation into a punchline. I was the homespun girl from a dusty town in the Central Valley, the simple wife who didn't understand the high-altitude oxygen of Silicon Valley dynasties. As I stood there, tasting the hot, metallic tang of copper in my mouth, I looked at Julian. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his father, seeking approval, his hand already drifting back to the table where it found the fingers of Sienna Thorne, a billionaire heiress who had been seated in my place of honor. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I simply reached into my silk clutch and felt the cold glass of my phone. I typed 2 words to my father. Those 2 words were about to delete the Sterling Empire from the California coast in exactly 72 hours. But before I show you the wreckage, I have to take you back. I have to take you to the night I still believed that being enough was a matter of the heart, rather than a line item on a balance sheet. 3 years ago, I walked into the Sterling estate for the first time. I wasn't a titan's daughter then. I was just Maya, a girl who worked 60 hours a week at a pro bono clinic, wearing a thrifted charcoal blazer that I'd meticulously steamed to hide the frayed cuffs. I brought a bottle of wine from a local vineyard where I used to pick grapes during my summers to pay for textbooks. I loved Julian then with the kind of desperate, blinding loyalty you only give to someone when you're keeping a secret you think will protect them. I thought my father's identity was a burden I could spare him. I thought if I entered that world as a nobody, I could find out if Julian Sterling was a man who loved me for my soul, or for the potential of my shadow. That decision cost me 3 years of my life. It would also end up being the only thing that saved me. The Sterling estate didn't just look like money, it looked like history, the kind that is bought, polished, and then guarded by iron gates. When I handed my bottle of wine to the housekeeper, I saw Eleanor Sterling, Julian's mother, watching from the top of the marble staircase. She didn't look at my face, she looked at my shoes. They were department store flats, polished to a mirror shine, but she knew the brand within a microsecond. "Oh, Maya," she said, her voice like a silk cord tightening around a throat. How delightfully practical. She didn't take the wine. She gestured for it to be taken to the kitchen, likely to be used for a sauce or given to the gardener. Dinner was served on china so thin I was afraid to breathe on it. Julian sat to my left, his hand resting on my knee, a gesture I thought was supportive but realized later was a way to keep me anchored, to keep me from moving too much or speaking too loudly. Across from us sat Harris Sterling. He didn't look like a businessman, he looked like a statue carved out of granite and expensive whiskey. He didn't ask about my career or my dreams. He looked at me over the rim of a crystal glass and asked, "Tell me about your people, Maya." A man's foundation is only as good as the dirt he was raised in. I had practiced this. I told him my father worked in logistics, moving things from point A to point B. I told him my mother had passed when I was 19. I didn't tell him that logistics meant Vance Global, a company that owned the very shipping lanes the Sterling tech empire relied on. I didn't tell him that the dirt I was raised in was a 20,000-acre ranch that had been in my family since the gold rush. Harrison smiled, but it was the smile of a wolf looking at a sheep that had wandered too far from the flock. "Logistics," he repeated, turning to Julian. "So, he's a truck driver? A grease monkey with a fleet of rust buckets?" Julian laughed. It was soft, a mere exhale of breath, but he didn't correct his father. He didn't say, "Maya is brilliant." He just squeezed my knee and said, "Everyone has to start somewhere, Dad." I excused myself to the bathroom and stood at the sink, staring at my reflection. I realized then that the Sterlings weren't just wealthy, they were a cult of pedigree. I looked at the gold-leafed mirror and made a silent vow. I wouldn't tell them who my father, Caleb "Pop" Vance, really was. I wanted to see if Julian would stand by me when he thought I had nothing to offer his family's legacy. It was a test he was already failing, but I was too blinded by my own hope to see the grade. I walked back into the dining room just as Harrison was saying, "A man in Julian's position needs a partner who brings more than just kindness to the table. He needs a seat at a different kind of board." Julian nodded, his eyes fixed on his plate, and for the first time, I felt the cold realization that in this house, I wasn't a wife. I was an ornament that was rapidly going out of style. What the Sterlings didn't know, what Julian never bothered to ask, was that my father, Caleb Vance, doesn't look like a billionaire. He looks like a man who spent 40 years under the hood of a semi-truck because that's exactly where he started. He still drives a 2012 Chevy Silverado with a cracked windshield. He wears flannel shirts to meetings with investment bankers, and he lets them assume he's the maintenance man until it's time to sign the billion-dollar wire transfers. My mother, before she died, taught me a single rule. Maya, let them underestimate you. It is the cheapest advantage you will ever get in this life. I had taken that advice to heart. I had worked my way through law school on scholarships they assumed were handouts. I had taken a job at a humble clinic they assumed was because I couldn't get hired anywhere else. My father had stayed out of my marriage on one condition. He told me the day I married Julian, "Kiddo, I'll stay in the shadows if that's what you want. But the day you need me, you call. I don't care if I'm in the middle of a board meeting or a nap. You call, and I come." I thought I would never need that promise. I thought Julian was different from his father. I thought our love was a fortress. I didn't realize that a fortress is only strong if the person inside isn't the one trying to tear down the walls. For 3 years, I watched Julian slowly morph into a carbon copy of Harrison. The soft laugh became a sharp bark. The supportive hand on the knee became a controlling grip. And the secret of my father grew from a small protective shield into a massive, looming weight. By the end of the second year, the mask was slipping. The Sterling's tech empire was beginning to feel the heat of a market crash. They were over-leveraged, bleeding cash, and desperate for a bailout. They started looking at me not with disdain, but with a predatory kind of annoyance. I was the debt on Julian's personal balance sheet. I was the reason he couldn't marry into the Thorne family and secure the billions they needed to survive the winter. I started keeping a black notebook, not for grocery lists, but for receipts. Every insult Eleanor hurled at my simple upbringing, every time Harrison called my father a grease monkey, while sipping wine my father could have bought the entire vineyard to produce, I wrote it down. I began to realize that Julian didn't just ignore the insults. He was starting to participate in them to prove his loyalty to the Sterling name. He began staying out late, claiming, investor meetings, that smelled of expensive perfume and gin. When I confronted him, he would look at me with a cold, distant pity and say, "Maya, you wouldn't understand the pressures of this world. Go back to your clinic. Do your little good deeds. Leave the real work to the people who were born for it." I would just nod and go back to my notebook. I was waiting for the moment the real work would finally meet the real power. One night, Julian came home late, his tie loosened, looking more frantic than usual. He didn't see me sitting in the darkened library. He was on the phone with his father, and the speakerphone was loud enough to vibrate the mahogany desk. "We're 14 months in breach of the debt covenants, Julian," Harrison's voice boomed. "If the senior lender calls the note, the campus, the patents, the name, it all goes to auction. We need the Thorne merger. We need Sienna." Julian's voice was tired, but it didn't hold a single ounce of hesitation. "I know, Dad. I'm handling Maya. She's loyal, she's quiet. She'll sign whatever exit agreement I put in front of her when the time comes. She thinks love is enough. She has no idea what's actually happening." I sat in the dark, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I felt a strange, cold peace wash over me. I wasn't hurt anymore. I was clinical. I was a lawyer looking at a failing contract. I reached into my bag and pulled out the copy of the Sterling Tech campus debt disclosure I had, quietly, acquired through a contact at my old firm. I flipped to page 84, the section detailing the senior lender. There, in small, unassuming print, was the name of the holding company, Vance Capital LLC. My father didn't just work in logistics. He was the man who owned the Sterling's debt. He was the grease monkey who held the keys to their kingdom. I closed the file and looked out the window at the rolling hills of Napa. Julian thought he was preparing an exit strategy for a simple girl. He had no idea he was actually preparing the funeral for his own legacy. I picked up my phone and saw a message from my father's general counsel. The Q4 audit was starting on Monday. The clock was ticking, and Julian was about to find out that the nobody he married was the only person with the power to keep him from drowning, and I was starting to lose my appetite for the rescue. The morning after I heard Julian's voice vibrate through that mahogany desk, I didn't confront him. I didn't scream or pack a bag. Instead, I did something far more dangerous. I went to the kitchen and made him the exact kind of artisan coffee he liked, watching him drink it while I sat across from him in my thrifted bathrobe, playing the part of the devoted, oblivious wife. I watched his eyes dart toward his phone, watched the way he checked his reflection, smoothing a hairline that was starting to recede from the sheer pressure of his own lies. He looked at me and saw a girl from a dusty town who was lucky to be in his presence. I looked at him and saw a man who was mathematically insolvent. I spent that afternoon in a small, windowless office in the back of my legal clinic. I wasn't reviewing tenant disputes. I was looking at the Sterling Vance debt covenant, specifically section 4.2. It was a shadow contract, a piece of financial architecture so complex that Julian, for all his MBA swagger, had clearly never bothered to read the fine print. The Sterlings had spent 3 years treating my father like a punchline, never realizing that every time they missed a growth target or over-leveraged their campus, they were handing another piece of their soul to Vance Capital. My father had been holding the default notice for 14 months. He hadn't sent it because of me. He was waiting for my signal. I realized then that I wasn't just Julian's wife, I was the only thing standing between the Sterling family and a total eclipse. I signed the updated asset disclosure my father's lawyer had sent over, a document that listed my personal holdings as a mere pittance, and I smiled. I was giving them exactly what they wanted, a target they thought was too small to hit back. The gift of smallness is a peculiar thing. When people believe you are beneath them, they stop performing. They let their guard down. They speak as if you are part of the furniture. Over the next few months, I became a ghost in my own home. At the Sterling's annual spring gala, Eleanor handed me a small, beautifully wrapped box. I opened it to find a housewife's journal, bound in faux leather. It was the third one she'd given me in 3 years. "For your little recipes and clinic notes, dear," she said, her voice dripping with that toxic brand of Napa Valley sympathy. "It's important to stay occupied while Julian handles the heavy lifting." I thanked her with a smile that reached my eyes but stopped at my heart. I took my seat at the far end of the table, relegated to the junior executives and spouses section, while Julian sat at the head of the room next to his father and Sienna Thorne. I watched them from the periphery. I watched the way Harrison Sterling leaned in toward Sienna, his eyes hungry for the Thorne billions. I watched the way Eleanor touched Sienna's arm, a gesture of inclusion she had never once offered me. They were already moving me out of the frame, airbrushing me out of the family portrait in real time. But as they laughed and toasted to their imminent expansion, I was busy under the table. I wasn't taking notes on recipes. I was documenting the death by 1,000 cuts. I noted the date Julian removed our wedding photo from his office. I noted the time Harrison called my father a low-rent mechanic in front of a state senator. I was building a ledger of every moment they chose their pride over my humanity. I realized that memory is a liability, but a written record is a weapon. I was no longer just a wife, I was a historian of their downfall. The deeper I went into their world, the more I saw the rot beneath the gilding. Julian started coming home with excuses that were as thin as the Sterling's credit line. He'd tell me he was at late-night strategy sessions, but his jacket would smell of the specific, wood-fired hearth at the reserve, Sienna Thorne's favorite private club. One evening, he walked into the bedroom and found me sitting on the edge of the bed, holding the black notebook. For a second, a flash of genuine panic crossed his face. "What's that?" he snapped, his voice sharper than usual. I looked up, my expression as blank as a fresh sheet of paper. "Just some notes for the clinic, Julian. We're seeing a lot of families losing their homes lately. It's heartbreaking." He exhaled, the tension leaving his shoulders as he succumbed once again to the comfort of underestimating me. "That's the problem with you, Maya," he said, moving to the mirror to unknot his tie. "You focus on the crumbs. You don't understand that in this world, some people are meant to hold the shears, and some are meant to be the wool." He didn't even turn his head to look at me when he said it. He was talking to his own reflection. I went to the closet and pulled out a dress for the upcoming anniversary gala, a simple, beige silk that Eleanor had approved for me. It was a dress designed to make me disappear into the background. I hung it on the door and looked at it. Julian thought he was the one holding the shears. He had no idea that I had spent the last 3 years weaving a net, and that the wolf was about to become a noose. My evidence log was now a digital fortress. Every text Julian sent to Sienna that he thought he'd deleted, every recorded conversation from the speakerphone slips, every breached covenant from the Vance Capital files, it was all there, organized with the cold precision of a forensic accountant. I wasn't just looking for a divorce, I was looking for a total liquidation of their ego. I spent my lunch hours at a park 3 towns over, meeting with my father's head of security. He handed me a folder of photographs, Julian and Sienna at a boutique hotel in Carmel, their hands intertwined over a table of untouched appetizers. "Do you want these leaked?" he asked. I looked at the photos, at the man I had once thought would be the father of my children, and I felt nothing but a dull, distant pity. "No," I said, sliding the folder back. "Not yet. A leak is a distraction. I want them to see it in a room they can't leave." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place on a Tuesday afternoon. I received a frantic call from the clinic's receptionist saying there was a gentleman waiting for me who refused to give his name. I walked into the waiting room to find Gregory Finch, my father's oldest friend and the most feared corporate litigator on the West Coast. He looked out of place in the plastic chair, surrounded by stacks of old magazines and the smell of cheap coffee. He stood up when I entered, his eyes scanning the room with a lawyer's instinct for weakness. "Kiddo," he said softly. "Your father sent me. He says the Q4 audit just hit a snag. A big one." We went into my office, and he laid out a single sheet of paper. It was a wire transfer request, signed by Julian, moving $6 million from a restricted maintenance and operations account, an account tied directly to the Vance Capital loan, into a private shell company. It was a blatant fiduciary breach. It wasn't just a mistake, it was a crime. "He's desperate," Gregory whispered. "He's trying to bridge the gap before the Thorne merger closes so the auditors don't see the hole in the Sterling accounts. He thinks he can put it back once he's married to Sienna's money." I looked at the signature. Julian's handwriting was bold, confident, as if he believed his own name was enough to make the theft legal. I felt the last chord of my hesitation snap. I realized then that Julian wasn't just discarding me, he was gambling with my father's legacy to fund my replacement. I looked at Gregory. "How long do we have?" I asked. "The audit clears in 72 hours, he replied. "If we don't move by the anniversary dinner, the Thorne merger goes to the board for a final vote. Once that happens, the money gets buried, the debt gets restructured, and the Sterlings walk away clean." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where real people were struggling to pay their rent while Julian played God with millions that weren't his. I thought about the beige dress. I thought about the split lip I knew was coming. I thought about my father, sitting in his truck in Worcester, waiting for the one call I had promised I would never have to make. I turned back to Gregory, my voice as cold as a mountain stream. "Tell Pop to get the truck ready. We're going to Napa." That night, Julian didn't come home until 3 a.m. I pretended to be asleep, listening to him shower, listening to the way he hummed a tune that I realized was the song the string quartet always played at the Thornes estate. He crawled into bed, careful not to wake the simple girl, who didn't understand the pressures of his world. I laid there, staring at the ceiling, counting his breaths. I realized that within 72 hours, the man lying next to me wouldn't just be my ex-husband. He would be a man without a title, without a campus, and without a single person in this valley who would take his call. The shadow contract was ready. The notebook was closed. All that was left was the performance. I closed my eyes and whispered a single word into the darkness, a word that would become the anthem of the next 3 days. Goodbye. As the sun began to peek over the Napa vineyards the next morning, Julian woke up and kissed my forehead, a practiced, hollow gesture of affection. Big day tomorrow, babe, he said, checking his watch. The anniversary gala. It's going to be a turning point for the family. I need you to be perfect. No talk about the clinic, no sad stories. Just smile and look like a Sterling. I watched him walk out the door, his suit perfectly pressed, his ego fully inflated. I reached under my pillow and pulled out my phone. I saw a news alert on the lock screen, Thorne Sterling merger set for final approval Friday. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. I knew something Julian didn't. I knew that by the time that merger vote was supposed to happen, there wouldn't be a Sterling company left to merge with. But as I started to get dressed, my phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of the beige dress I had hung on the door. The caption read, "It's a shame to waste such a pretty dress on a ghost." I dropped the phone, the glass shattering against the hardwood floor. Someone else was watching. The shattered glass of my phone screen felt like a premonition, a jagged map of the next 48 hours. I didn't replace the phone. I didn't call the police. In the world of the Sterlings, the police were just people you hired to direct traffic at your garden parties. I simply moved the SIM card to an old burner phone and went back to the script. Julian was already at the office, likely sitting in a glass-walled conference room with Sienna Thorne, carving up the future of a company that was technically already underwater. I spent the day at the clinic, but my mind was in Napa. I was looking at the guest list for the anniversary gala. It wasn't a celebration of a marriage, it was a coronation of a replacement. Sienna wasn't just a guest, she was the replacement candidate. She was the multi-billion-dollar bandage for the hemorrhage Julian had caused. I watched the clock on the clinic wall. Every tick was a reminder that Julian's exit strategy for me was moving into its final phase. He had stopped calling me Maya in private. Now, I was just babe, a generic term used to fill the space where a name should be. It was the verbal equivalent of a placeholder. Eleanor Sterling had even sent over a professional makeup artist for the beige dress fitting. As the woman applied a layer of foundation that felt like a mask, she whispered, "You have such a classic look, Maya." Very quiet. I knew what she meant. In this valley, quiet was a synonym for invisible. They wanted me to be a ghost at my own feast, a silent witness to Julian's new alliance. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who was perfectly camouflaged. I was the wallpaper they were about to tear down, and they had no idea I was the only thing holding up the ceiling. At exactly 11:14 p.m., Julian was in his home office, the door cracked just enough for the light to spill onto the hallway carpet. I was standing in the shadows, holding a glass of water I didn't intend to drink. I heard the low, rhythmic thrum of his father's voice on the speakerphone. "The Q4 audit is a disaster, Julian. If the Thorne merger doesn't sign by Friday midnight, the bank triggers the acceleration clause on the campus loan. We lose the patents. We lose the name." Julian's response was cold, calculated, stripped of the charm he used on me. "I've got the exit papers ready, Dad. Maya's voluntary separation will be framed as a mental health break. She's too fragile for the Silicon Valley pace. It keeps the PR clean for the Thorne announcement on Saturday morning." I stood in the hallway, the cold water sweating against my palm, and I felt a strange sense of vindication. They weren't just moving on, they were planning to gaslight me into a mental health facility to keep their merger pristine. They were going to discard me like a faulty line of code. I realized then that the audit wasn't just failing, it was a crime scene. Julian had spent 14 months lying to his own board, and he was planning to use my fragility as the rug to hide the bodies. I walked back to our bedroom, my footsteps silent on the deep pile rug. I sat in the dark and realized the reveal was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. I wasn't just fighting for my dignity, I was fighting to stay out of a gilded cage. Julian thought he was handling a delicate situation. He had no idea he was handling a live wire. The hard-hitting peak arrived not with a shout, but with a piece of paper. The next morning, Julian left early for a pre-gala briefing, leaving behind a stack of mail on the marble island in the kitchen. Tucked between an invitation to a charity polo match and a property tax bill was a weathered, cream-colored envelope. I recognized the handwriting instantly. It was from my mother, written in the final week of her life, addressed to me and marked with a date 12 years into the future. My father must have slipped it into the mail as a signal. I broke the wax seal with trembling fingers. Her voice echoed off the page, crisp and timeless. Maya, the people who try to make you small are never truly big themselves. They are terrified of the space you take up. Do not comfort their fear. Do not shrink so they can feel tall. Your father and I have been ready since the day we met you. When you stop waiting for them to be better, call him. He will come. I sat on the kitchen floor, the expensive marble cold against my legs, and I finally let the tears come. Not for Julian, not for the Sterlings, but for the girl I had been for the last 3 years, the girl who thought she had to be small to be loved. I realized that my patience hadn't been a virtue, it had been a lingering death. My mother hadn't been telling me to wait for Julian to change, she had been telling me to wait for the moment I was strong enough to leave him behind. I felt a surge of power that started in my chest and radiated to my fingertips. I didn't need Julian's permission to exist. I didn't need Eleanor's approval or Harrison's respect. I was Maya Vance, the daughter of a titan who wore flannel and a mother who knew how to weaponize silence. I stood up, wiped my face, and picked up the burner phone. I called Pop. He answered on the first ring, the sound of a diesel engine idling in the background. Kiddo, he said, his voice a low, steady rumble that felt like home. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I didn't apologize for the 3 years of silence. I simply said, Dad, I'm done waiting. They're planning to move me out tomorrow night. Julian's embezzled $6 million to cover the audit gap, and they're seating Sienna in my place. There was a long silence on the other end, the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. Then, my father spoke, his voice dropping into that terrifying, quiet register he only used when he was about to dismantle something. Gregory's already in Napa. The default notice is signed and notarized. I've been sitting in the truck for 4 hours, Maya. I'm 11 minutes from the Four Seasons. You tell me when you want the lights to go out. I looked at the beige dress hanging on the bedroom door. It looked like a shroud. I thought about the 400 guests, the press, the photographers, and the way the Sterlings would look when the grease monkey they had mocked walked through those double doors. I thought about the black notebook, the evidence log, and the shadow contract that was about to become the Sterlings' nightmare. I felt a cold, sharp clarity. Not yet, Dad, I whispered into the phone. I want them to finish the dance. I want Julian to give his speech. I want him to believe he's won. And when he raises his glass to the Thorne merger, that's when I want you to walk in. I hung up and walked to the closet, pulling out a pair of small pearl earrings, the only thing I had left from my mother. The rest of the day was a blur of high-tension performance. I attended the final walkthrough at the Four Seasons ballroom. I watched Julian and Sienna discuss the floral arrangements as if they were picking out a nursery. I watched Eleanor instruct the servers to ensure Maya has a quiet corner near the exit. I smiled. I nodded. I was the perfect, invisible wife. But every time I saw Julian look at Sienna with that hungry, calculating gaze, I thought about the wire transfer request in Gregory's briefcase. I thought about the material misrepresentation charge that was about to hit the SEC. Julian thought he was trading up. He had no idea he was trading his freedom for a headline. As the sun began to set over the valley, turning the vineyards into a sea of bruised purple and deep gold, I realized the transition was complete. I was no longer the girl in the thrifted blazer. I was the architect of the 72-hour eclipse. I went back to the house to get ready. The silence in the Sterling estate was heavy, like the air before a storm. I put on the beige dress. I put on the pearls. I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't see a victim. I saw a ghost who was about to become very, very solid. Julian walked into the room, looking at his watch, not my face. "Time to go, babe," he said, his mind already at the podium. "Remember, just smile. If anyone asks about the clinic, tell them you're taking a sabbatical. Let's make this a night to remember." I looked at him, really looked at him, for what I knew would be the last time as his wife. "Oh, I'm sure it will be, Julian," I said, my voice as smooth as the silk on my back. We walked down the stairs, out the door, and into the waiting limousine. As the car pulled away from the estate, I felt my phone buzz in my clutch. It was a message from an unknown number, the same one that had sent the photo of the dress. This time, it was just 4 words: "The doors are open." My blood went cold. Someone was already in the ballroom, and they weren't waiting for the toast. The Four Seasons ballroom was a cathedral of curated lies. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen explosions above 500 guests who represented the concentrated ego of the valley. The scent was a suffocating mix of expensive lilies and desperation. I walked in on Julian's arm, feeling the weight of the beige dress, a garment designed to blend into the marble, while he wore his custom tuxedo like armor. I saw the seating chart near the entrance. Table 1. Harrison at the head. Eleanor to his right. Julian. Then Sienna Thorne. I was tucked at the far curve, separated from my husband by the very woman he intended to use to erase me. It was an anniversary trap so transparent it was almost insulting. Julian squeezed my hand, but his eyes were already scanning the room for the press, for the photographers, for the validation he craved more than air. I scanned the room, too. I wasn't looking for the socialites. I was looking for the red light of the cameras. I saw a reporter from Business Insider and a photographer from Vanity Fair hovering near the stage. Julian had invited them to document his triumph, unaware they were about to witness his autopsy. I felt the burner phone in my clutch vibrate, one long pulse. That was Gregory. He was in the building. Somewhere in the sea of black ties and silk gowns, the man who held the shadow contract was waiting. I took my seat, the orchid centerpiece obscuring my view of Julian's face, which felt appropriate. We were already miles apart. The first course was served, poached pears that tasted like nothing, and I watched the geometry of the table. Julian leaned towards Sienna, their shoulders brushing in a way that wasn't accidental. Eleanor watched them with a predatory approval, while Harrison held court, his voice booming about the new era of Sterling dominance. The air in the room felt thick, charged with the static of a coming storm. I checked my watch. 11 minutes until the coronation toast. I looked at the exit doors, massive slabs of oak and brass, and imagined my father standing behind them in his work boots. The Sterlings had spent 3 years laughing at the grease monkey, never realizing that the man they mocked was currently the only reason the lights in this ballroom were still on. I felt a strange, detached calm. I wasn't a wife at a party, I was a witness at a deposition. I reached down and touched the edge of my black notebook, hidden in the silk lining of my bag. It was time for the final entry. I looked at Julian, who was laughing at something Sienna whispered, and I realized he had already forgotten I was there. He was performing for a future that didn't include me, and I was about to make sure that future didn't include him either. The slap heard round the valley didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the result of 1,000 smaller strikes over 3 long years. It began when Harrison stood up, tapping his crystal flute with a silver knife. The room went silent, the kind of heavy, expectant silence that precedes an execution. "Friends, partners, titans," Harrison began, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. 3 years ago, my son brought home a girl from a world we didn't quite understand. We've watched her try to fit into the Sterling legacy. We've been patient. A ripple of polite, cruel laughter moved through the room. I felt Julian's hand move under the table, but it wasn't for me. He was holding Sienna's hand, their fingers intertwined in plain view of his father. I stood up. I didn't plan it, but the smallness my mother warned me about finally reached its limit. "Harrison," I said, my voice cutting through the laughter like a blade. "If you're going to talk about my world, perhaps you should mention the part where your company wouldn't exist without it." The room gasped. The Vanity Fair photographer's shutter clicked, a rapid-fire sound that felt like a heartbeat. Julian stood up, his face flushing a deep, panicked crimson. "Maya, sit down," he hissed, his voice a low, vibrating threat. "You're embarrassing yourself. You're drunk." I wasn't drunk. I was the only sober person in a room full of people intoxicated by their own shadows. "I'm not sitting down, Julian. And I'm not fragile. I'm the woman who read the audit you've been hiding for 14 months. That was when it happened." Julian didn't think, he reacted. It was the panic of a man who sees his exit strategy evaporating in real time. He swung his hand, not a punch, but a backhanded strike that caught me across the mouth. The sound was sharp, a wet crack that seemed to resonate in the sudden, vacuum-like silence of the ballroom. My head snapped back, and I felt the familiar, hot sting of copper as my lip split against my teeth. I didn't fall. I gripped the edge of the table, my knuckles white, and I looked Julian directly in the eye. For a second, the room was so still you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Then, a lone laugh broke the silence. It was Sienna. She laughed as if it were a scripted part of the entertainment, a theatrical resolution to a domestic dispute. A few others joined in, nervous titters from people who didn't know how to react to a Sterling losing control. I wiped the blood from my chin with a white linen napkin, looked at the red stain, and smiled. It was the most expensive mistake Julian Sterling would ever make. I didn't scream at Julian. I didn't slap him back. I reached into my clutch with a steady hand, pulled out the burner phone, and held it up so the reporter could see the screen. I typed 2 words, "Now, Pop." I pressed send and set the phone face up on the white tablecloth, right next to the poached pears. The screen stayed lit, a glowing beacon in the dim, expensive light of the ballroom. Julian was shaking now, his chest heaving, his eyes darting toward his father, who had gone the color of ash. Eleanor was frozen, her hand clutching her pearls so hard I thought the string would snap. They knew. In that split second of silence, they realized the grease monkey's daughter hadn't been waiting for their love, she had been waiting for their crime. "The audit clears in 72 hours, Julian," I said, my voice steady, amplified by the silent attention of 500 people. "But the default notice is already in the building. You embezzled $6 million from a Vance Capital account to fund your replacement candidate. That's not a divorce, Julian. That's a felony." The room began to murmur, a low, rising tide of realization. The bankers at table 14 stood up as one, their faces grim. They knew the name Vance. Everyone in logistics knew the name Vance. They just didn't know the name was mine. Harrison tried to speak, his mouth working like a landed fish, but no sound came out. He looked at the exit doors, the same ones I had been watching all night. He was waiting for security to come and escort me out, to erase the homespun girl who had dared to speak. I picked up my glass of water and took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the cold liquid soothe the ache in my lip. I looked at Julian, who was staring at the phone on the table as if it were a bomb. "You told your father I was a nobody who didn't understand the pressures of this world," I whispered. "But you're the one who didn't understand, Julian. You're the one who thought power was a tuxedo and a name on a building. Power is the man who owns the dirt the building is sitting on." I looked at my watch. 3, 2, 1. The double doors at the back of the ballroom didn't just open, they groaned under the weight of someone who didn't care about the etiquette of Napa Valley. A shadow fell across the polished marble floor, long and wide, stretching all the way to table 1. The string quartet stopped playing mid-note. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I knew the sound of those work boots. But as the room held its breath, I saw something in Julian's eyes that wasn't just fear, it was a recognition of someone else standing in the doorway behind my father. The silhouette in the doorway didn't belong in Napa. It was too broad, too rugged, and draped in a navy canvas work jacket that had seen more engine bays than gala ballrooms. My father, Caleb "Pop" Vance, didn't wait for an invitation. He walked down the center aisle with the heavy, unhurried gait of a man who owned the ground he was stepping on. Behind him, Gregory Finch moved like a shadow, clutching the leather portfolio that contained the Sterling's death warrant. The room didn't just go quiet, it became a vacuum. The socialites leaned back as if Caleb were a ghost, but the bankers, the men who actually understood the plumbing of the valley's wealth, stood up. They knew the face. They knew the man who controlled the global shipping lanes that kept their tech giants alive. Caleb stopped at the edge of table 1. He didn't look at the chandeliers or the $500 centerpieces. He looked at me. He saw the blood on my chin and the swelling of my lip. He didn't roar. He didn't throw a punch. He simply reached into his pocket, pulled out a clean, white handkerchief, and handed it to me. His eyes were like flint. "You done, kiddo?" he asked. His voice wasn't loud, but in that silent ballroom, it carried like a gavel strike. I took the handkerchief, pressed it to my lip, and nodded. "I'm done, Pop." He turned then, his gaze landing on Julian, who looked as though he had been turned to salt. Julian's hand, which had been so bold when it struck me, was now shaking so violently that his wine glass shattered against the floor. Gregory Finch stepped forward, opening the portfolio on the white linen tablecloth, right over the Sterling's expensive poached pears. "Notice of event of default and immediate acceleration," Gregory announced. The words were cold, clinical, and final. He began to read the line items, the 14 months of breached covenants, the unauthorized wire transfers, and the $6 million hole Julian had dug to impress the Thornes. Harrison Sterling tried to stand, his face a mask of purple rage. "Vance? You're the mechanic? This is some kind of sick joke." My father didn't even blink. He looked Harrison in the eye and said, "I'm the man who owns your debt, Harrison. And as of 60 seconds ago, I'm the man who's calling it in. You've got 72 hours to vacate the campus. Bring your lawyers to my office on Monday. And Harrison? Don't wear the suit. It won't help." The collapse of the Sterling dynasty didn't take years, it happened in 72 hours of absolute, silent liquidation. By Saturday morning, the Thorne-Sterling merger wasn't just cancelled, it was toxic. Sienna Thorne had vanished before the valet could even bring her car around that night, leaving Julian to face the wreckage alone. Because Julian had signed those asset disclosures without reading the fine print, the shadow contract I had helped Gregory draft 3 years prior, he had inadvertently tied his personal fortune to the company's default. The estate in Napa, the fleet of Italian cars, the private jet, it was all collateral. It was all gone. I spent those 72 hours in a hotel room in San Francisco, watching the news alerts roll in like waves. Sterling Tech CEO removed for fiduciary breach. SEC opens inquiry into Sterling embezzlement. Julian tried to call me 42 times. I didn't answer once. I didn't need to. Every time my phone buzzed, I just thought about the 3 years of Housewife's journals and the beige dresses. I thought about the way Eleanor had airbrushed me out of the family photos. On Monday morning, the final blow landed. The board of directors, desperate to save what was left of the patents, voted unanimously to remove both Harrison and Julian from the company they had built on a foundation of arrogance. They were banned from the campus. They were banned from the industry. They were, for the first time in their lives, exactly what they had accused me of being, nobodies. I met Julian one last time at the lawyer's office to sign the final papers. He looked 10 years older. His hair was unkempt, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and the arrogance had been replaced by a hollow, haunting desperation. He sat across from me and reached for my hand, but I pulled it away. "Maya, please," he whispered. I was under pressure. "My father, the audit. I didn't mean to hit you." We can start over. Your father has billions. We could rebuild together. I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt a genuine sense of relief. I wasn't angry anymore. I was free. You still don't get it, Julian, I said, sliding the black notebook across the table. You didn't lose the company because of a market crash. You lost it because you thought the person sitting next to you was an ornament. You didn't read the contract, Julian. And you never bothered to read me. 6 months after the lights went out in the Sterling ballroom, I found myself back in the Central Valley. I didn't return to the high-rise offices or the Napa social circuit. Instead, I stood in front of a renovated warehouse in my hometown, a building that used to be a failing tire shop. Above the door, a new sign hung in the afternoon sun, the Ellen Vance Justice Initiative. It was a pro bono legal center, funded entirely by the liquidation of the Sterling's personal assets. We didn't take clients with six-figure retainers. We took the grease monkeys, the grape pickers, and the women who had been told they were too small to matter. Opening day was quiet. There were no photographers from Vanity Fair, no state senators, and no poached pears. There was just a pot of strong coffee and 40 folding chairs. My father was there, wearing the same flannel shirt he'd worn for 20 years, leaning against the doorframe and pretending he hadn't spent the morning crying in his truck. On the wall behind my desk, I hung the only photograph I kept from my time in Napa. It wasn't a wedding photo. It was a picture of my mother, laughing in a yellow raincoat, taken years before the world tried to tell her she was insignificant. Below it, I had framed a single sentence from her final letter: "Dignity doesn't need a comment section." Our first client walked in at 9:15 a.m. She was a young woman with a tired face and a stack of legal documents she didn't understand. Her landlord was trying to evict her while her husband was away at work. She sat down, her hands shaking, and looked at me as if I held the keys to the world. I reached across the desk, not with a controlling grip, but with an open hand. "Tell me everything from the beginning," I said. "I have all day. And don't worry, they always underestimate the ones who listen." I looked out the window and saw my father in the parking lot, helping an old man change a tire on a beat-up Ford. He looked up, caught my eye, and gave me a small, grease-stained thumbs up. I finally understood what my mother meant. The Sterlings had spent their lives trying to buy a legacy, but they had forgotten that a real legacy isn't built on what you take from people, it's built on what you refuse to let them take from you. I wasn't the homespun girl or the fragile wife. I was a Vance. And in this dusty town, in this quiet office, I realized that I hadn't just deleted an empire. I had found my own. As the sun set over the Central Valley, casting long, golden shadows across the ranch land, I picked up a wrench my father had left on my desk and felt its weight. It was heavy, it was solid, and it was real. Just like me. If you've ever been the quiet one at the table, the one they didn't think was worth a second glance, just remember, the loudest move you can make is the one they never see coming. I'm Maya Vance, and I'm finally done waiting.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe Family Files for more.